A schoolboy read books to an old lady every weekend. But one day, she gave him her diary. The old woman never spoke much, but her eyes told stories no one else bothered to hear. Every Saturday afternoon, Ethan walked the narrow path lined with overgrown hedges, clutching a stack of books, the scent of paper and old ink mingling with the sharp air of late autumn. At 15, he was restless, like most boys his age, but there was something about that house, the way it sagged under the weight of time, its windows like half-closed eyes that called to him. Her name was Mrs. Aldrich. Nobody in town remembered much about her. Some said she was a widow, others whispered about a son lost in a war no one wanted to remember. She lived alone in the last house before the woods began, a place most kids crossed the street to avoid. But Ethan liked stories. Not just the kind bound between covers, but the ones people wore on their faces, in the brittle curve of a hand, in the way their voices trembled at names they no longer spoke. And he'd noticed, on the day he delivered groceries to her for the first time, that Mrs. Aldrich's eyes followed the book under his arm more than the sack in his hand. "Would you read to me, boy?" she had asked thin, voice thin as parchment. So he did. And then he came back the next Saturday, and the next. The room they sat in was a world untouched by now, wallpaper curling at the corners, the air thick with the scent of cedar and dust. A clock ticked on the mantel, its sound steady as a heartbeat. Faded photographs lined the shelves, a young soldier grinning in a uniform, a girl on a swing, a couple caught mid-laugh in some long-lost summer. Ethan read everything Dickens, Poe, old newspapers from a box in her attic. She rarely interrupted, but sometimes her eyes would cloud, and a name would slip from her lips, or a hand would reach out as if to grasp something only she could see. He never asked. Until that one rainy evening in November. The storm had come fast, wind rattling the windows like an anxious hand. Ethan arrived soaked, water pooling in his shoes, the books under his jacket. Mrs. Aldrich was waiting by the fire, her chair turned toward the door. "You're late," she murmured, though there was a small smile tugging at her lips. "Sorry." Ethan shrugged, dropping the books on the table. "Bus broke down." She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. But there was something different in her eyes tonight. A restless glint. "Not tonight," she said when he reached for a volume of O. Henry's stories. He blinked. Not the books." She lifted a small, worn object from her lap. An ancient diary, its leather cover cracked, a brass clasp rusted but still holding firm. She extended it toward him with trembling fingers. "Read this." He hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. The fire flickered against the diary's cover, casting shifting shadows across her lined face. "What is it?" "My life," she said simply. "The parts nobody knows." He took it. The clasp gave way with a soft click, and the pages smelled of old ink and lavender. March 4th, 1949. I met Samuel today. He was standing by the riverbank, the sun catching in his hair, and for a moment, I felt like I'd stepped into a story I'd read as a girl. Ethan glanced up. Mrs. Aldrich's eyes were fixed on the fire. He kept reading. The entries were delicate, the cursive precise but faded, recounting days of dances at the community hall, stolen kisses by the lake, promises whispered in darkened kitchens. And then war. Samuel was drafted. She wrote of tear-streaked farewells, nights spent by the radio, the gnawing ache of waiting. Then a name appeared that made Ethan pause. "Nathaniel. He was my son," she said softly, as if sensing the boy's confusion. The diary told of a pregnancy kept secret, a hurried wedding before Samuel shipped out, of a baby born in a quiet house on a storm-heavy night. But something was wrong. The entries grew fragmented. Lines crossed out. Ink blots where tears had fallen. June 17th, 1952. The letter came. "Samuel is gone. They never found him. They won't even bring him home. Nathaniel keeps asking for his father. What do I tell a child who won't remember his face?" Ethan swallowed. He had never imagined her young, never pictured her laughing, running barefoot through fields, or cradling a baby to her chest. He turned the page. And there a photo, slipped between the sheets. A woman with hair like molten gold and eyes fierce with joy. A boy of maybe 4 clutching her skirt. "What happened to them?" he asked, voice rough. She closed her eyes. "I lost them both, and the room felt like it might break under the weight of it. I was too young," she whispered. "Too stubborn. I made mistakes, boy. The kind you carry like stones in your chest." Ethan reached for her hand. "I ran from my grief. I left him with family, Couldn't look at his face without seeing his father. I told myself it was better, that I'd find my way back. But time it doesn't wait for cowards. There was a long, shivering silence. Ethan didn't know what to say. What could you say to a life's worth of regret? So he kept reading. The diary chronicled years in cities whose names blurred together, jobs she took and lost, nights spent staring at motel ceilings, chasing a peace that never came. She wrote of returning to the town decades later, an old woman with nothing but ghosts, of learning that Nathaniel had died young, a car crash on a rain-slick road. I never told him I loved him, she said, and the sound was a splintered thing. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the room held only memory. Ethan didn't leave that night. He read until his throat ached, until the fire burned low and dawn began to silver the sky. When he finally set the diary down, Mrs. Aldridge was asleep, her hands still curled in his. He looked around at the room, the photographs, the brittle wallpaper, the sagging shelves, and saw not decay, but a life stitched together from what was left. And something in him changed. For the first time, Ethan understood that people weren't just the stories they told. They were also the stories they buried. He made a silent promise then, to come back next Saturday, and every Saturday after. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is listen. The following Saturday, the sun came out. It was one of those brittle winter mornings where the sky looked too pale, too wide, like a canvas stretched too thin. The air was sharp, but clean, and Ethan felt it slice through his lungs as he made his way down the familiar path. The old house waited at the end, stooped and weary, but somehow less heavy now. He had the diary under his arm. Mrs. Aldridge was awake when he arrived, sitting by the window this time, her thin fingers tracing the glass where frost had gathered in delicate spirals. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said quietly. "I said I would." She turned to him then, and for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker in her eyes, something shy of hope. Ethan took his usual seat by the fireplace. The room was as it always had been, yet everything felt altered. He could almost sense the stories the walls held, the echoes in the floorboards. It was strange how grief left fingerprints on places. "Do you want me to keep reading?" he asked. She nodded. He opened the diary where he'd left off. November 3rd, 1954. I found Nathaniel's photograph today in a box of old letters I couldn't bear to burn. He would be 6 now. I wonder if he still has the same dimples when he smiles. I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he's alive. God forgive me. The words cut deep, though Ethan barely knew why. He wasn't much older than Nathaniel had been then, and the idea of being forgotten by your mother felt like a wound you couldn't touch. As he read, Mrs. Aldridge's breathing slowed, her gaze fixed far beyond the room, into memories she no longer tried to cage. "I dreamed about him last night," she murmured, not looking at Ethan. "He was by the river, barefoot, like when he was little. I tried to call to him, but my voice wouldn't work. He just smiled and waved, like he'd forgiven me already." Ethan swallowed. He didn't know what forgiveness cost, but he imagined it was heavier for the one who needed it most. He turned another page. January 12th, 1961. I saw a boy in the market today. For a moment, I thought it was him. He had the same dark hair, the same crooked grin. I nearly called out his name. But when he turned, it wasn't Nathaniel. Just a stranger's son. I went home and drank until I couldn't remember the shape of his face. Ethan felt a pressure in his chest. The diary wasn't just a record, it was a confession. A testament to a life lived wrong. A plea for absolution too long delayed. But there were lighter moments, too. Scattered between grief's relentless march were fragments of joy, a spring storm she'd danced beneath, a night at the cinema with a kind stranger, the scent of oranges in a market square. They gleamed like tiny coins in the dark, reminders that even the lost deserved moments of grace. "Why are you giving this to me?" Ethan asked at one point, unable to stop the question. Mrs. Aldridge gave a small, sad smile. "Because no one else remembers," she said. "And you listen." And so he did. Week after week. They fell into a rhythm. Ethan would come in the late afternoons, sometimes with old books, sometimes just the diary. Mrs. Aldridge would listen, her expression shifting with the words, her hands trembling less as time passed. Once, she surprised him by laughing. It was a thin, brittle sound, like the first crack of ice in a thawing river. But it was a laugh. He'd been reading a passage where she described sneaking into a dance hall without a ticket at 17, her hair done up in pin curls, the borrowed shoes too tight on her feet. I was terrible at it, she chuckled. Tripped over my own hemline. But Samuel caught me before I hit the floor. Said I fell for him faster than the music. Ethan grinned. Smooth. Oh, he was. Dangerous kind of smooth. And for a moment, the years peeled back, and he could see the girl she'd been. It was strange how quickly the habit formed. The other kids at school teased him when they found out, called him names, asked if his new girlfriend was collecting dust. But Ethan didn't care. Because there was something about that house, about those hours, that felt more honest than anything else in his life. His own father had left when Ethan was 8. A note on the table, a bank account emptied, no explanation. His mother had never spoken of him since, and Ethan had learned not to ask. But Mrs. Aldridge's stories, they gave voice to the ache he carried. They named the silence, and in doing so, made it bearable. One evening in late December, she handed him a box. It was small, wrapped in yellowed paper, a faded ribbon clumsily tied. For you, she said, for keeping an old woman company. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a pocket watch. The glass was scratched, the hands forever frozen at 6:32, but it was beautiful in its ruin. It was Samuel's, she said. He gave it to me before he left for Korea. Said if I kept it close, time would pass faster. Never did. Ethan turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of years pressed into metal. I can't take this. You can, she insisted, voice fierce. Because you'll remember. When I'm gone. A silence hung there. Neither of them spoke of death, but it lingered in the corners like another guest, waiting. Ethan put the watch in his pocket. Thank you, he said. And meant it. January 3rd, 1977. I came home for the last time today. The house is smaller than I remember. The town unchanged. No one recognizes me. I don't blame them. The cemetery on Willow Lane is overgrown. I found his grave. Just a stone, no flowers. I left one. It was all I had. The words blurred on the page. Ethan's throat tightened. Did you ever forgive yourself? He asked quietly. Mrs. Aldridge didn't answer for a long time. Then she reached out and laid her hand over his. No, she said. But I stopped asking to. He understood. Some weights weren't meant to be lifted, only carried. When spring came, the garden outside her window bloomed in defiance of the years. Daffodils thrust through hard earth. Birds built nests in the eaves. And Mrs. Aldridge began to fade. It wasn't sudden. A missed word. A lost name. A day when she didn't wake until past noon. The town's doctor came and went, his face grim. Ethan read anyway. Even when she drifted, eyes half-lidded, lips moving to memories he couldn't hear. The diary was nearly finished. And on one rainy evening in early May, he turned the final page. April 20th, 1999. I dreamed of Nathaniel again. He was at the river, waiting. Said it was time to come home. I think I'll go tomorrow. If there's a God, let me hold him once. Tears blurred the ink. Ethan closed the book, his throat raw. Mrs. Aldridge stirred in her chair. I saw him, she whispered, voice thin as mist. Last night. Ethan took her hand. He said it's all right. Said he forgave me. And then she smiled. The kind of smile that made years fall away. Tell me the story again, she murmured. He opened the book and began. Sorrowful eyes and trembling hands holding an ancient leather-bound diary, the room filled with faded photographs and an air of bittersweet nostalgia. He began from the start, not with the printed books they'd once shared, but with the first words she'd written as a young girl. March 4th, 1949. I met Samuel today. Ethan read, his voice steady in the hush of the room. He was standing by the riverbank, the sun catching in his hair. Outside, the evening bled into a violet dusk. The trees shivered in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 7 times. Mrs. Aldridge's eyes fluttered closed, her hand still cool in Ethan's. The room no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt sacred, not in the way churches did, with marble and hymnals, but in a quieter, older sense of space shaped by memory, sorrow, and something just shy of grace. And Ethan kept reading. It wasn't until hours later, when the fire burned low and the clock chimed 9, that he realized she hadn't spoken again. He set the diary down. Mrs. Aldridge? No answer. Her face was peaceful, lines softened by sleep or something deeper. The faintest trace of a smile lingered on her lips, like she was dreaming of rivers and boys with crooked grins. Ethan's throat tightened. He sat with her until the house grew dark. When the doctor came the next morning, the verdict was gentle. In her sleep, he told Ethan's mother, who'd arrived pale-faced and anxious. They left the old house to Ethan for one last afternoon. No one else wanted to go inside. He walked its halls alone, touching the books they'd read, the faded photographs, the worn chair by the window. Everything whispered her name. On the mantel, he found an envelope addressed in spidery handwriting. To Ethan. Inside was a single page. You gave an old woman her voice back. Don't ever stop listening. The world forgets people too easily. Be the one who remembers. A. He folded the letter, slipping it into his pocket beside the broken watch. At the cemetery on Willow Lane, they buried her beside a stone marked Nathaniel Aldridge, 1949 to 1974. Only Ethan stayed after the others left. He placed the diary on the grave, its leather cover pale in the sun. I finished it, he said softly. I remember. He stood there for a long time, not out of grief alone, but because in that moment, he realized he wasn't just mourning her, he was carrying her forward. That fall, Ethan began volunteering at the town's nursing home. He read to those whose families no longer visited, listened to the ones who'd long since fallen silent. And everywhere he went, he carried a little notebook in his jacket pocket. To remember. Because somewhere along the way, in the small, quiet places people left behind, he learned that stories didn't live in books. They lived in people. And those people, no matter how forgotten, deserved to be heard. Years later, a woman named Clara Monroe would find a collection of bound journals in the town's library archive, all signed EA. Inside were stories, hundreds of them gathered from the homes and hospital beds of those the world had let fade. She would read them one by one, and in doing so, come to know a boy who once read to an old woman in a crumbling house by the woods. And in the final volume, she'd find a single photograph. A teenage boy with dark hair and kind eyes, sitting by a fireplace, a diary open in his lap. Behind him, an old woman smiled. On the back, written in a hand faded by time. Some stories save us. Ethan stood at the threshold of his high school graduation ceremony the following May. He'd taken a vow that night at the cemetery, and now he carried its weight like a silent promise. Over the past years, he volunteered every weekend at the nursing home, at veteran centers, and even helping town archivists digitize forgotten letters and photograph albums. Each life he encountered had become part of him, weaving threads into a tapestry richer than any novel. That morning, his mother pinned a humble corsage on his lapel, the dusky pink of peonies. She was proud but tired. This moment meant everything. The school auditorium buzzed with chatter and nervous smiles. Ethan's gaze drifted outward, beyond the sea of black caps, to the window at the back where sunlight filtered in, a reminder of the room at Mrs. Aldridge's house, the flicker of fire, her hushed voice asking him to read one more page. He closed his eyes, feeling her presence. The ceremony passed in a blur of speeches and applause. His name was called. He walked across the stage slowly, shaking hands with the principal. He glanced down, seeing pinned beside the principal's boutonniere one of those tiny pops of pink peony. His mother had chosen it for him. On his way back, a small voice cried, "Ethan," and he saw Mrs. Monroe, the archivist from the library, waving. She wore a sweater in the same dusty pink tone. After the ceremony, she handed him a slender box wrapped in burgundy paper. "From someone," she said, her eyes warm. He unwrapped it to find the broken pocket watch, fixed. The glass was clear, the hands moved in unhurried circles, tick, tock, meaning. Engraved on its back was MNDEA, for keeping time with stories. He pressed it to his ear. It ticked steadily. He looked up. Clara Monroe smiled. "She wanted you to have it at this moment." He swallowed. "Thank you." That summer, Ethan packed a small trunk. His dad never left a note, but he'd inherited that restlessness. He left the town for college, majoring in literature and oral history. But every weekend, without fail, he wrote letters to the nursing home residents he'd befriended, and once a month, he sent copies of his journals to Mrs. Monroe, sparing her with polished lines he called collected stories of quiet lives. One afternoon in October, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was clear, firm. "Ethan Aldridge?" "Yes." "This is Dr. Simmons at Willow Lane Nursing. Mrs. Carter is declining. You've been consistent in your letters. I wondered if you might visit." He didn't wait. All his college roommates saw him vanish the next weekend. He drove 16 hours to the home, parked by a window overlooking the old cemetery. He found Mrs. Carter in a private room, frail but bright-eyed. She reached for his hand when he walked in. She recognized him. "Nathaniel's friend," she whispered, referencing the diary's boy. That linked him to Mrs. Aldridge's world. She said she didn't know Ethan, but she'd been there that day, years ago, and Mrs. Aldridge had told everyone. They talked in low tones. Ethan read to her from a short memoir he'd written, light on grief, heavy on the moments that made life sacred. She nodded, tears glistening. "You're carrying her voice," she said. He took that as the highest praise. He stayed later than the visiting hours allowed. That night, he made a decision. He would spend the rest of his life gathering these voices. He would build a collection not just as journals, but a spoken history of neighbors, of overlooked names, of stories that rounded into heaven like stones cast into ponds. He returned to school with renewed purpose. He proposed a thesis, a project recording oral histories of veterans from the local community, using his journals as narrative backbone. His advisor approved, stunned by Ethan's passion. He spent the next year interviewing, transcribing, and weaving. One by one, their voices came alive. Sergeant Ramirez's first love, Mrs. Jenkins's secret poems, Mr. Patel's childhood in Kashmir, old narratives that smelled of tamarind and jasmine, of dusty roads and never-forgotten homes. He would play them recordings and watch eyes change, especially those of young listeners. Eyes that widened to realize history wasn't read in books, it was spoken by people whose hands shook, but whose memories blazed. By graduation, his thesis was called Echoes of Quiet Lives. His presentation included audio clips, each voice distinct yet connected. When he finished, his audience was silent. Then a woman rose, tears in her voice. This is what literature is supposed to do. One crisp December evening, Ethan walked the path by Willow Lane Cemetery. Snow frosted the ground, and the windows of Mrs. Aldridge's old house were dark. He'd visited its archive, found no record of her living heirs. The house itself sat quietly, their stories already leaving its walls. He placed fresh peonies by both Nathaniel Stone and Mrs. Aldridge to markers now side by side under the same sky. He pressed the fixed pocket watch into the cold earth beside them. Time passed, but stories stayed. A man stepped from behind a gravestone. Ethan tensed. "Are those your peonies?" the man asked gently. He wore a cardigan, and in his brace's eyes Ethan recognized Clara Monroe's handwriting, an engraved name, A.S., on his gravestone stone. The stranger offered a small box. Inside was a journal, blank, leather-bound, same style as Mrs. Aldridge's. "For you," said the man. "Her final gift?" Ethan opened it. On the first page, "Start here." He understood. He carried it home, took out the first page. He began to write, the story of a boy and an old woman who taught him to remember. He wrote of fireside pages, of diaries and voices, of forgiveness and grief. And with each word, he honored her unspoken prayer. The night after he left the cemetery, snow fell heavily. Ethan sat by his dormitory window, watching the world turn white. He thought of Mrs. Aldridge's window and how they used to watch the same snowfall in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, sharing nothing but a story. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Clara Monroe. "Your copy of Echoes of Quiet Lives arrived. Reading it now. It's beautiful, Ethan. You should be proud." He set the phone down. He wasn't proud, not exactly. He was grateful. Later that night, he returned to the journal the man at the cemetery had given him, the one with the simple inscription, "Start here." He opened to the second page. A sentence in familiar, looping script waited there. There is more left to tell. For a long moment, Ethan sat motionless. The house on Willow Lane was empty now, the lights dark, the furniture covered in cloth. He'd thought the story was finished. But in a way he'd come to understand, no story was ever finished while someone remembered. The next morning, with the snow still heavy on the ground, he made his way to the town library. The archive room was empty, but the records clerk on duty nodded when he asked for the Aldridge family records. "You're the kid who used to read to her," the man said softly. Ethan nodded. The man disappeared into the back room and returned with a dust-coated box. Inside were yellowed pages, black and white photographs, and several brittle letters. At the very bottom, wrapped in faded blue ribbon, was a small stack of postcards. The first was addressed to Nathaniel Aldridge, dated 1949. The image on the front was a watercolor painting of a lake ringed by pine trees. Ethan turned it over. "Dear Nathaniel, I saw a place today that made me think of you. You would have laughed at the way the trees leaned like old men. The water was the color of dusk. Wish you were here. M. No last name. No address." Ethan's heart pounded. M. Could it be? He rifled through the rest of the postcards, tracing the handwriting. Some were signed with an M, others with a flourish, but none said more. All spoke of places and memories scattered across years. He pieced together a story. Mrs. Aldridge had loved someone before Nathaniel. Or perhaps after. Perhaps someone Nathaniel had known. The details were elusive, but the ache in the words was unmistakable. One card stood out, postmarked years after Nathaniel's death. The orchard blooms again this year. I remember you both. Some stories can't be told. Some must be kept. It wasn't signed. Ethan copied every word into his notebook. When he left the archive room, dusk had fallen. Snow clung to the trees like frostbitten lace. He called Clara Monroe. I found something, he said. Someone Mrs. Aldridge loved. Or maybe someone who loved them both. Clara was quiet for a long time. Bring it here, she said finally. There's a file you haven't seen. Back at the library, in the deepest part of the basement, she handed him a leather-bound folder. Restricted Archive, Aldridge Estate. Inside were legal papers, a faded birth certificate, and one final diary entry in Mrs. Aldridge's unmistakable hand. December 25th, 1974. I lost them both today. Nathaniel to the storm, and him to grief. He left before the year was out. I'll not write their names again. Some things belong to the earth. Ethan's throat tightened. Who was he? He asked. Clara hesitated. Matthew North, she said quietly. Your grandmother's cousin. A friend to both of them. He vanished after Nathaniel's death. It all fit. The M on the postcards. The final diary entry. The man in the cemetery, his grave marker's initials. A.S. Who was A.S.? Ethan asked, his voice rough. Clara's lips parted. Arthur Simmons, she murmured. He was Matthew's partner. They lived together in the orchard after the war. But back then, well, you know how it was. Ethan did. He closed his eyes, imagining the narrow world they'd lived in, the losses they'd carried in silence. The next day, Ethan visited the orchard. The trees stood bare in the snow, their branches black against the white sky. A small wooden bench sat at the edge of the field, half buried. He brushed snow away and found initials carved there. N.A. plus M.N. He traced them with his fingers. For the first time in years, he cried. He stayed until the light drained from the sky. When he left, he took a branch from the oldest tree of fallen peace, weathered but strong. In his dorm room, he whittled it into a simple bookmark, carrying it always inside the journal marked, Start Here. He would remember them all. Not just Mrs. Aldridge and Nathaniel, but Matthew North, Arthur Simmons, the orchard and the storm. The quiet love no one spoke of but that endured in postcards and diary margins. He wrote their names down, one by one. He read their stories aloud at his graduation speech. And when he moved away years later, he left a single book in the town library. On the first page, for those who remembered when no one else would, it was bound in soft brown leather, the cover embossed with the title Echoes of Quiet Lives. Inside were their names, their words, their days. Somewhere in that book was a boy and an old woman in a small, crumbling house by the woods, a ticking watch, and a story that refused to end. And Ethan knew, finally, it never would. Weeks turned into months, and the sting of winter finally gave way to spring. Ethan returned to Willow Lane one final time before leaving town for good. The house stood in silence, abandoned, its once carefully tended garden overgrown with wild violets and sprigs of clover. The shutters hung crookedly, and the front porch sagged under its own weight. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb, a hollowed space where echoes of other people's lives clung to the air. He pushed open the rusted gate and made his way to the orchard behind the house. The trees had begun to bloom again. Pale pink blossoms trembled in the soft wind, petals already littering the ground like confetti from some unseen celebration. The old bench still sat beneath the tallest tree. Ethan brushed his hand over the initials carved there years ago, N.A. plus M.N. He sat down, staring at the tangle of branches overhead. There was a strange kind of peace in the orchard now, a finality that wasn't cruel, but inevitable. Ethan reached into his backpack and took out the bookmark he'd made from the fallen branch, the same one he carried since the winter. He placed it on the bench beside the carved initials and whispered aloud, "You're remembered." He wasn't sure who he meant. Maybe all of them. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blooming apple trees. A bird called out from somewhere high in the branches. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel alone. As he left the orchard, a soft warmth settled in his chest, and he understood that stories didn't belong to just the people who lived them. They belonged to those who carried them forward, even in fragments. The following week, Ethan boarded a bus to a city 300 miles away to start his new life at university. The town faded behind him, swallowed by distance and memory. Yet even as new people and places filled his days, Mrs. Aldrich and the orchard remained with him. In moments of quiet late at night, while studying, or walking beneath trees heavy with spring blooms, he'd feel her presence like a steadying hand on his shoulder. The words she left behind lived in him now. One evening, during his second year, Ethan attended a guest lecture on forgotten American writers. At the end, as students filed out, a gray-haired woman approached him. "You're Ethan Holloway, aren't you?" He turned, surprised. "I am. I was a friend of Clara Monroe's," she said, her voice soft and worn by time. "She told me about the book you wrote and about Mrs. Aldrich." The woman's name was Marion Wren, a retired librarian from a neighboring town. She carried a canvas bag with worn leather straps, and inside it, a stack of old journals. "I thought you might want these," she said, handing them over. "They belonged to Arthur Simmons. He left them with me before he passed." Ethan's heart skipped. "You knew him?" She smiled sadly. "I did. Arthur was a gentle man, kept to himself most of the time. But he loved Matthew with everything he had. After Nathaniel died, Matthew came apart. Arthur tried to hold him together. But well, the world wasn't kind to men like them back then." Ethan ran a hand over the top journal. The leather was cracked, but the initials ES were still visible. "I can't tell you how much this means," he murmured. Marion reached into her bag again and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It showed 4 people standing in the orchard: Nathaniel, Mrs. Aldrich as a young woman, Matthew, and Arthur. They stood close together, smiling with the easy warmth of people who loved one another deeply. Ethan's throat tightened. "May I keep this?" Marion nodded. "It belongs to you now." That night, Ethan read Arthur's journals cover to cover. They told stories of war and loss, of quiet courage and forbidden love. He learned about the orchard's early days, about secret picnics in the moonlight, about the storm that claimed Nathaniel's life, and the grief that chased Matthew away. One entry stayed with him. October 31st, 1952. "The world has no place for men like us. But here, in the orchard, with him, I am free. If the world will not remember us kindly, let it at least remember we were here." Ethan wept reading it. He gathered Mrs. Aldrich's diary, the postcards, Arthur's journals, and all the notes he'd taken, and began assembling them into a manuscript. This time, it wasn't a fictionalized account or a novel based on fragments. It was a true story, told in their own words. He titled it The Orchard Letters. The book was published quietly, without much fanfare, but word spread through small towns, libraries, and historical societies. It became a cherished piece of local history, preserving the lives and loves of people time had tried to forget. Ethan received letters from readers thanking him. People who shared stories of their own long-lost relatives, of secret romances, of small towns where nobody spoke aloud of such things, but where hearts broke all the same. Years passed. Ethan became a professor, teaching American literature and oral history. He always included Mrs. Aldrich's diary and Arthur's journals in his syllabus, ensuring that new generations would know their names. He kept the photograph Marion Wren had given him framed on his desk. It reminded him every day that the quietest lives often carried the deepest stories. When he returned to Willow Lane as an old man himself, the house was long gone. The orchard, however, still stood. He walked beneath the gnarled branches, now heavy with age, and found the old bench had collapsed into the earth. Vines had claimed it, but the initials remained visible in the wood. Ethan knelt beside them, brushing away leaves. "I kept my promise," he whispered. A breeze stirred the branches overhead. He stayed until night fell and the first stars blinked into the sky. Before leaving, he placed a new book on the ground, his final collection, a volume of stories gathered from people across small towns like theirs. On the inside cover, in trembling script, he'd written, "To those who lived in silence, may your stories finally be heard." He smiled as he left the orchard one last time. The past had found its home. The next morning, a group of children exploring the old orchard found the book. They sat beneath the ancient tree, reading aloud to one another. And so the story continued, not because someone remembered, but because someone cared enough to listen. It was enough. It always would be.